That's right. Is that this?
That doesn't matter. Sorry,
That's
that's
the
the
mouse.
pointer.
Yeah,
Just
that's
do
the
the-
pointer.
I'll show you the pointer. We need the pointer and then just do your slide, next slide, whatever you want.
Yeah, thank you. I think I've got it all sorted now. Can you hear me okay, everybody? Yes. I'm told I have a voice that doesn't carry very well. Anyway, first of all, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to tell you about Thomas Telford's tollhouse at Alison's Bank, Gretna, and for coming out on such a cold evening. Geography, roads and maps are everything when it comes to the history of Alison's Bank tollhouse. And it's via roads and maps that I came to do my research, as they are my particular interest. The first two things to bear in mind in the story of the tollhouse are that the eastern border of Gretna parish is the River Sark. And at this point, I'll just get the hang of the pointer here, is also the border with England. The third thing is that Gretna was on two important national roads, that leading from Carlisle and northwest England to Moffat and Glasgow, here, and that leading from Carlisle, northwest England to Annan, Dumfries, Castle Douglas, Gatehouse, Newtonstew, and Port Patrick, and across to Ireland. And it's to such roads, of course, that toll houses owed their existence. And the roads to Gretna have a particularly interesting history. By the middle of the 18th century, there was a choice between two routes to get from Gretna. I'm not getting a hand at this very well. Gretna, it's more sensitive than I thought it would be. From Gretna to Carlisle. And what a choice. Take your pick by the unengineered, poorly maintained and alarmingly named Quaking Sands coastal road, or by the equally unengineered and poorly maintained inland road along the Dun and Dreary Bog. Oops. I broke this on the way here, so it's quite likely to collapse. Right. This 1804 map of Crawford shows both routes. The Quaking Sands came from Gretna Green down to Sarkfoot and across Ford at Sarkfoot, down here and forded the Esk at its estuary, and either went straight down here to Stanwix, north of Carlisle, and across a wooden bridge over the Eden, or it went across various fords across the Eden and approached Carlisle from the northwest. This was the route taken by Edward I on his way to Scotland and by Bonnie Prince Charlie's Eastern Division in 1745 on their way south to meet up with him at Carlisle. It was described as being upon clay and not well made, often very troublesome and hazardous when the rivers were swollen. The Dun and Dreary Bog Road went east from Gretna Green, up here, and along here and crossed the Sark upstream by another ford. That bridge mark there wasn't there at the time. And this place here is called Plump. It then went along the southern part of the Solway Moss and crossed the Esk by a ferry at Longtown, and it was here that it met the road coming from Edinburgh, which went due south to Stanwix and Carlisle. With its many yet to be drained peat mosses north of Carlisle, this inland route may well have been no less treacherous than the coastal route. even though this picture of peat cutting in the area was painted at the beginning of the 20th century, it perhaps gives some idea of the terrain at that time. And this road was 10 miles longer, as you can see, along here, as opposed to the more direct coastal route. That meant, in the case of a slow-moving wagon, that the journey could take 5 hours longer and use up more feed for the horses. And as you may be able to see from the piles of trees against the buttresses on this rather forbidding photo taken in February, taking a fairly basic ferry across this river when it was in flood would not have been for the faint-hearted. However, in the mid-18th century, this inland road was improved. For a start, in 1756, the ferry over the Esk was replaced by this bridge. It's a fine 5-arch bridge. Then between 1763 and 1764, a short section at the Gretna end became the very eastern end of a new military road that was being built from the border of Plump to Port Patrick. So here is Plump again, where it's marked Sark Bridge, but there was no bridge. Plump, that little section there to Gretna Green became part of this new military road, which of course we now know as the old military road. And that was built because the government needed an engineered road to move troops expeditiously between its garrison at Carlisle and Ireland. The project included replacing the ford at Plump with a bridge in 1804 marked Sark Bridge. It wasn't long before the government realised that if troops were to be moved along it, the Carlisle to Plump road also needed to be improved. And this was undertaken in 1764. From this time, despite its extra length, the long town route became the main road from Carlisle to Gretna. And from there, along the new military road to Annan, Dumfries and Port Patrick too. The Carlisle to Gretna stretch also became part of the main Carlisle to Glasgow road. West of the new bridge there at Plump, it went along here and split from the military road that went along there. Another road went here along the Roman Barras Road up towards Moffat and Glasgow. These improvements at the southern end of the Carlisle to Glasgow road may have helped out, but unfortunately there continued to be many difficult stretches along the 90-odd miles north of Gretna, not least where it now, unbelievably, went through Moffat and over the Devil's Beef Tug to its north. It was clear by the early 19th century that despite the improvements in the Carlisle to Gretna stretch, with the manufacturing centres of Glasgow and Carlisle becoming increasingly important, the whole of the route between the two cities needed to be upgraded and lengthy or difficult sections bypassed. With the expensive Napoleonic Wars finally ending in 1815, the government released money to the road commissioners for the great Dumfriesshire engineer Thomas Telford to carry out this crucial national project. Back to Crawford's map. One of Telford's important bypasses was the 10-mile diversion through Longtown. In order to do this, Telford set the line of his road in Carlisle between the coastal road and the Longtown road to cross the Sark at Alison's back about here by a new bridge just about here and along that line approximately. And that's Thomas Telford's Sark Bridge, built in 1822. At this point, the lower Sark Bridge, this one, the 1822 one, became known as the Sark Bridge, and the one that had been up at Plump which had been the Sark Bridge, then became the Plump Bridge, just very confusing. This 1822 map of Reed shows the detail of the road route through Gretna in pink. It went from the new bridge here up to Gretna Green, past Gretna Hall here, there, and joined the old Longtown Springfield Road northwest of Gretna Green. The road was run by a road trust which had the right to collect tolls for its maintenance. The first toll house north of Carlisle was Kingstown. Extended, it was for a few years a branch of HSBC, but is now a branch of the dreadful Subway fast food chain. I think you might all agree with me there. Near the turn off to Asda. You may not have seen it because it's actually set back from the road among quite a lot of industrial car parks, etc. The one we're interested in today at Alison's Bank was here beside the new Sark Bridge there. One of Tate's 1759 plans of the Gretna estate shows that Alison's Bank farm was divided into 4 fields, 69, 70, 71 and 72. The toll house was erected in 1820, the southeast corner of field 72, right next to the Sark and the border with England. As a stewardship audience, you may be interested to hear that at this time, the Gretna estate was owned by James Douglas of Orchardton in Almoness. He was the brother of William Douglas of Gelston and founder of Castle Douglas. This shows a contract for the sale of the 20 falls of land for the toll house at £50 per acre, and for the land taken up by the bridge and the road between the bridge and the toll house at £40 per acre. By the time the road commissioners settled the bill for the land in 1822, it had passed to James's daughter, Sarah Maxwell. The toll house was built for Telford by John Park. He came from a Dumfries family of masons. Many of the bridges in the county were built by them. His father had built Robert Smirke's prestigious Kinmount House for the 6th Marquess of Queensberry, so they were a prestigious firm of masons. John went on to do further building for Telford, including some of the bridges along the road. This is the front of his contract for the toll house. This photo, taken about 1900 of the toll house, it shows how it would have looked on completion as it was approached from Carlisle, though the front door would not have been blocked at that time. Toll houses were let annually by public route or auction. This is the advert for the first route for the toll house in 1822. And now we come to some of the characters who became involved with the toll house. It's a shame that I only have time to tell you about a few of them. The first known tollkeeper was a man named Gibson. Nothing is known for certain about him, except that he got into trouble with the excise. Despite widespread condemnation from the Kirk, toll houses were allowed to sell spirituous liquors, and they were certainly in an ideal position to catch the passing trade. But to do so, they had to hold an excise license. For some reason, Gibson had been refused such a license. He was caught when he sold whiskey to an incognito excise man from England. There was apparently a great deal of rivalry between the excise men on the two sides of the border, so this wouldn't have gone down well on the Scottish side. As a result, this excise man's Scottish counterpart, Joseph Train, was demoted for not having discovered the crime himself. You'll probably recognize his name as that of the well-known antiquarian Joseph Train. Another early tollkeeper, George McQueen, also sold alcohol, as recorded in a small book in Dumfries archives. Here we see the first page of his alcohol sales. As well as bemoaning Gretna's many tippling houses, as they were called, its ministers were appalled by its infamous irregular marriage trade. Marriages in Scotland at that time could legally be carried out by anyone. The ones referred to as irregular were those carried out by someone other than a clergyman. Bans and licenses were not required. Ministers of Church of Scotland referred to the places where irregular wedding ceremonies took place as altars of Baal, and to the men who carried out such ceremonies as high priests of Hymen. Hymen was, of course, the Greek god of weddings. These so-called priests were not, of course, ordained, some of them being recorded as the likes of hedgers and ditchers, but surprisingly not blacksmiths. This practice of irregular marriages had taken off following Lord Hardwicke's Marriage Act of 1754, when marriages without bans or a license had become illegal in England. Various places along the border attracted runaway couples from England, attempting to defy the prohibitions of their parents, as one commentator put it. And with Gretna being the most southerly, it became the most popular. So popular, in fact, that Thomas Pennant, the well-known 18th century traveller, referred to it in 1769 as the resort of all amorous couples. In the very early days, many of these marriages were conducted on the Solway Sands. From 1791, with the establishment of Springfield, the marriages were conducted at the Queen's Head there, as it was conveniently on the main road. Once Telford's Road was built, it wasn't long before Gretna Hall Inn, being right beside it, also got in on the irregular marriage trade. So it's not surprising that the toll house, even closer to the border, wasn't far behind it, with George McQueen conducting the toll house's very first marriage there in September 1832 between Alex Mulholland and Mary Sanderson from Sowerby. Mary Sanderson and Alex Mulholland. As with about 85% of the toll house's couples, both were from Cumberland. Also, like many of the toll house couples, you'll see from the X's below their names that instead of their signatures, that neither could sign, indicating that they were from the so-called lower orders. Analysis of the couples married in the toll house between 1848 and 1849 shows that 26% of grooms and 63% of brides could not sign their names. The Queen's records show that between the Mulholland's marriage and May 1835, when he left the toll house, he had married 342 couples. He was succeeded by Simon Beattie. Unfortunately, the whereabouts of his records is unknown, but I estimated that he'd married around 1,900 couples by the time he left the toll house in 1843. It seems that it was seldom that his couples were above the rank of those on foot. Apparently, he would lure people into the toll house and try to marry the most improbable couples. For example, people unknown to one another, or already related, like an old woman and her nephew. And if he couldn't be bothered to get out of bed, one of his 4 strapping daughters would don his blacks and conduct the ceremony. It's one of his certificates. Beattie's successor in 1843 was John Murray. He was another great character. He and some of his sons married an incredible 6,852 couples in the 21 years they were at the toll house. According to later commentators, Murray was astute, formidable, intelligent, and respected. He was also an energetic businessman who hoped to make money by leasing toll houses from the road trustees and subletting them. On coming to Alison's bank, Murray was also able to profit from the irregular marriage trade built up by his predecessors, and like them, he concentrated on the poorer end, making up for lack of quality with quantity. His standard charge was 7 and 6 per couple, plus a shilling for each witness, but he could be flexible depending on the couple's finances. He sometimes went as low as 6 old pennies. This flexibility and his location as first house in Scotland resulted in a substantial and sustained volume of trade. It was said that despite the rarity of wealthy couples, not long after starting in the marriage business, his pockets were so crammed with fees that he waddled like a duck. Business was particularly brisk during the Carlisle hiring fairs. During one Martinmas fair, cabs and tub jigs bearing couples were said to be queuing back to Guard's farm near Gretna station in England. On the 11th of November, 1854, he married as many as 41 couples on one of the fair days and 77 over the whole fair weekend. The Carlisle press was outspoken in its criticism, reporting scandalous doings at Gretna, outrage upon decency and decorum, improvident marriages are innumerable, seduction is rife. The criminal courts attest the prevalence of bigamy at such times. Yet with the donning of his blacks for his ceremonies, it was said that no man could have looked more reverend or respectable. His ceremony consisted of asking if each couple was unmarried and whether they had a ring, then getting them to join hands and asking each if they took the other to be their lawful wedded husband or wife. He declared them married before God and the witnesses. It was said that Murray instituted an addition to this simple ceremony. His wife Mary would take the couple through to a bedroom and place them on the bed for a few symbolic seconds, thereby allowing Murray to argue to pursuing parents the futility of making a fuss because the marriage had already been consummated. With the tollhouse being at that time in an isolated location, he sometimes found it hard to conjure up witnesses, importuning travellers at the toll gates to fill the role. His records indicate that some of his children also acted in that capacity. With the opening of Gretna station just south of the border in England, Gretna marriages greatly increased. Most couples could afford third-class tickets, which were in any case cheaper than Church of England marriages. For those being pursued by frantic parents, express trains had the advantage of being impossible to overtake. Such was the great rivalry among the priests that they took to lying in wait for couples arriving at the station. The station master took the precaution of making them wait behind the railings, because the competition could sometimes get so out of hand that the platform became the scene of touting tussles with rows, scuffles, and even the occasional blow. John Linton, the Gretna Hall priest, was so enraged by his competitors that he wrote to the newspapers, warning rail passengers against these beasts and land sharks who impertinently said that they were the cheapest and the most convenient. Linton was known as the bishop, for he and his clients were a good step up from his rivals and their clients, for he had cornered the so-called swagger marriage market. Murray had placed himself in the ideal position to take full advantage of the railway trade by renting the Graham Arms Inn beside the station. From here, he could intercept couples and lead them to the tollhouse, and following the marriage, he could take them back to the inn to lodge. Murray was not infrequently called on to give evidence in court cases where disputed paternity, obligations for maintenance, inheritance, bigamy, and the like hinged upon the legality of his marriages. He seems to have relished exposure to the public and used the courtroom as his stage. In one case at Carlisle Crown Court, he was reported to have treated the affair with merriment and fun, and to have had such a large stock of assurance that he could hold his own with the barristers. But his fortunes were soon to change. By the 1840s, there were demands for restrictions on drinking establishments, with the Kirk and the strong Sabbatarian and temperance movements in Scotland being very much part of this push for reform. In some instances, the church singled out licensed toll houses as being in particular need of restriction. As a result of all this pressure, a law was passed in 1853 which absolutely prohibited the granting of licenses to toll keepers. Perhaps partly in response to this, and despite few society weddings to his credit up until this point, Murray turned his mind in the mid-1850s to developing the quality side of the marriage business. To this end, he started building his Sark Bank Hotel on the English side of Sark Bridge. But just at this point, he was about to suffer a far bigger blow than the loss of his liquor license. As with the abuse of alcohol, the church had, of course, continued to oppose irregular marriage trade. But by the mid-1850s, concerns were coming from other directions too. In 1856, Lord Chancellor Brougham introduced a marriage bill to Parliament, which required that at least one of a non-Scottish couple wishing to marry in Scotland fulfill a 3-week residency in Scotland. It was surely more than a coincidence that it was Brougham who was leading the call for this requirement, for he had himself eloped to Coldstream and was said to have had many years of unhappy marriage in which to regret his youthful impetuosity. The Mayor of Carlisle arguing that the last thing alcohol-fueled couples at Carlisle hiring fairs needed was easy access to spur-of-the-moment marriage ceremonies, strongly favoured the bill and got up a petition to Parliament in its support. Unfortunately for Murray, just as his Sark Bank Hotel was on the point of completion, the bill was passed to come into force on the 1st of January 1857. With its residency requirement, the so-called Cooling Off Act effectively put a stop to the on-demand cross-border marriages offered by the Gretna priests. It was reported that when news of Brougham's Act reached Gretna, and with the ruin of his hotel staring him in the face, Murray, long noted for being an ingenious coiner of oaths, swore loud and deep. They came from him like violent claps of thunder. He was fair crazy, running about and tearing his hair like a lunatic. This is his Sark Bank Hotel. You may recognize it as the Gretna Chase Hotel. Murray died there in 1861, and despite his failed Sark Bank project, his will shows that his effects at the time of his death were worth more than £250,000 at today's values, and that he provided well for his wife and their 11 surviving children. Murray had previously vowed not to be buried in Gretna courtyard, where many of the other priests were laid, saying that he wadna lie among Seca tribe. Instead, he lies in Half Morton Kirkyard near Chapel Now, north of Gretna. A few years ago, he would not have been pleased to see that the tribe among whom he was lying could not, in fact, have been any fouler. The then occupants of the deconsecrated kirk were using the conveniently placed headstones along with chicken wire to accommodate their hens. The hens and the chicken wire have now disappeared. Perhaps Murray complained to the council. Murray's extraordinarily well entered and preserved 16 volumes of certificates are now in the care of Dumfries Archives and have recently been indexed, ensuring that many thousands can now easily trace the marriages of their forebears to Alison's Bank toll. Before going on to what happened after the marriages stopped, I thought I'd tell you about two of the most interesting ones. The first and one of John Murray's biggest catches was one of my favourites. It was a couple from London in 1856. Anne Cunningham was from a wealthy family in County Sligo. Sir Fitzroy Kelly's father was a captain in the Royal Navy, whilst his novelist mother was the daughter of the groom of the Privy Chamber to George III, no less. This was Sir Fitzroy's second marriage, for his first wife had died. Anne was 34 years his junior. Sir Fitzroy was an eminent man, being a judge specialising in commercial law and standing counsel for the East India Company and the Bank of England. He was also an MP, King's Counsel and Solicitor General in 1845, when he was knighted, and later Lord Chief Baron, quite a catch for John Murray. Despite being less accustomed to criminal defence, he was defence counsel in one of the great criminal poisoning cases of the early Victorian period, that of John Towell, dubbed the Quaker murderer in 1845. Despite being married, Towell was conducting a very long-standing affair with Sarah Hart, whom, with their 2 children, he had been maintaining at a secret address near Slough. By 1844, he'd been having severe financial problems, so that in 1845, he poisoned Sarah with the contents of 2 bottles of what was referred to as Schlie's prussic acid, a treatment for varicose veins, which was in fact hydrogen cyanide. Although by this time he had, for unrelated reasons, been disowned by the Quakers, he had continued to wear their distinctive dark clothing. And it was this that had made him identifiable to someone who had witnessed him leaving Sarah's house shortly before she died, and to the station staff who'd seen him boarding a train to London. The police immediately used the newly installed telegraph to send a message to Paddington, from where he was followed and arrested. At his trial, Sir Fitzroy argued that the poison had entered Sarah's body via her consumption of apples, the pips of which contained prussic acid. A barrel of the offending fruit had been found at her house. Despite Sir Fitzroy, the back on? No. No? No?
Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah.
Right. Despite Sir Fitzroy's efforts, Towell was found guilty and hanged in the presence of a huge crowd. It seems a bit intermittent.
No. Fine.
It's all right. Towell has the distinction of being the first person to be arrested as the result of the new telegraph, the first murderer known to have left the scene of the crime by train, and one of the first murderers to use prussic acid. Sir Fitzroy has the distinction of, ever afterwards, being known as, you've guessed it, Apple Pip. The age between our next bride and groom, though not as great as in the case of Anne and Sir Fitzroy, is of far more relevance. For the tollhouse hosted the marriage of perhaps the youngest of all Gretna brides. Between 7 and 8 a.m. on the 25th of May, 1854, John Murray married Anne Jane Ward and John Atkinson, both at that time living in Appleby in Westmoreland. That not all was as it should be might be suspected from the early hour of the wedding. Not only had Anne previously been a pupil of music master Atkinson at Ivy House boarding school in Appleby, not only was she due to come into a large inheritance of £10,000, but crucially she was, despite her precocity, both physical and mental, only 12 years old. Atkinson, who was 22, was from nearby Appleby, but other than that, little is known about him. At the crack of dawn, Anne had crept out of her bedroom at Ivy House to be driven with Atkinson to the railway station. Once alerted, the police intercepted the couple on their return journey at Carlisle station and arrested them. Atkinson was later charged with abducting a minor and, as the newspaper reporter of the court case put it, unlawfully taking her to Hyman's high priest. Atkinson's defence was that he did not abduct her, as she was willing, even eager, to go of her own free will, a claim he supported with several letters from Anne to this effect. Atkinson was given a 9-month sentence, and because the judge declared him a first-class misdemeanant, he was allowed to have his own mattress, food and books, and to be spared treadmill duties. Anne was taken to Jersey for 3 years to finish her education. The affair was, of course, a great cause célèbre, and despite the country's attention being occupied by the Crimean War, nothing changes. It caused a considerable stir, with much indignation being expressed at Atkinson's light sentence. Whether the marriage was valid was in doubt, with various authorities arguing the case both ways. But whatever its validity, and with her father's blessing, in September 1859, Anne and John were married in London in accordance with the rites of the Church of England. But this love story did not have a happy ending, for John succumbed in 1871 to one of the epidemics of black pox which hit Westmoreland in the 1870s, and was left with 8 children to rear, ranging in age from 7 months to 10 years. Returning to the toll house, after the Murrays left in 1864, it continued, of course, in its primary role as the residence of the toll keeper. And here we come to another stewardship connection. For one of the later keepers, an agricultural labourer named William Robinson, originally came from Parton. He and his family moved into the toll house sometime after 1861. As with many agricultural labouring families at that time, the Robinsons had moved around farms a great deal. In 1841, they had been at Step End. This was just below the Mottevere and right next to the stepping stones across the earth. And stepping stones aren't there anymore, but there is a small footbridge, I think, for use by fishermen. It must have made for a very damp and unhealthy house, because the house was about here, according to Ordnance Survey maps. Probably frequently flooded when the Ur was swollen. By 1851, they were in a cot house at Ford Now, which, as its name suggests, was on higher and surely drier ground. This belonged to East Logan Farm and was just above what was soon to become the back paddy line. I like to think of the excitement of their children as the line progressed and the steam from the first loco rose up to their cottage. The line was just here, along here in the dip. Immediately before they moved to Alison's bank, William had become toll keeper at Parton, also right beside the paddy line. The turnpike system had never been universally financially successful, with many road trustees failing to receive sufficient tolls to cover their costs. So by 1881, it had just about been phased out, with the administration of and payment for roads being taken over by county councils. Its last tollkeeper was Miss Marion Tate, another great character. In the 1860s, she'd been a tollkeeper at Floreston Toll House between Carlisle and Gretna. She'd been charged with selling alcohol illegally. As we've seen, selling alcohol in toll houses being made illegal in 1853. She'd also been charged with assaulting a non-toll payer with a potato beetle. I have one here my husband made earlier for me. I should think that would be pretty painful. Once the toll house was no longer used for toll collecting, it was sold. And here's where our stewardship landowners come back into the picture, for it was bought back by the Douglas family in 1884 in the persons of 2 descendants of the Sarah Maxwell, who had owned it in 1822. Both were called Matilda and both lived at Galston Castle, which is there in its heyday. Now it is a roofless ruin. I'm sorry about the angle, but it's now surrounded by a high fence and trees, so it's impossible to get near enough or far enough away to take a decent photograph. The longest surviving of the 2 Matildas was so old that she could remember the celebrations of the victory at Waterloo. Reported to be of genial and courtly presence and to have distributed charity with a lavish but unostentatious hand, she was said to be universally loved. On her death in 1890, the Douglases sold their entire Gretna estate, including, of course, the toll house. Both Matildas are buried in the Douglas Mausoleum at Kelton. By the outbreak of the Great War, Alison's Bank Farm and the toll house were owned by William Black Scott. As part of the 9,000 acres required by the War Office for the Gretna Munitions Factory, it was requisitioned from Scott in 1916. The toll house is at the far right-hand edge of the purple area. This is the different colours of the different sites of the factory. The toll house was never returned to Scott, continuing instead to be in the ownership of the Secretary of State for War until 1933. During this time, its tenant, Arthur Stevenson, revived the irregular marriage trade in the toll house and opened a museum in an extension he'd had built. There's the extension there, which is still there today, only it's swallowed by other extensions, but that's it. And this is how the marriage room would have looked at that time. In 1933, the Department of Agriculture took it over and a year later put it up for auction, resulting in the Mackey family taking on its ownership and Stevenson having to give up his marriage business and move out. The Mackeys already owned the old blacksmith shop up at the Green, where they'd been involved in the marriage trade since the 1890s. In his 5 years in the marriage business, Stevenson had married 142 couples. Even if he'd stayed in the toll house, he would have been unable to continue with his weddings after 1939, as a new marriage act outlawed anyone but a clergyman or registrar carrying out marriages. After World War II, the Mackeys used the toll house as a centre for their caravan and campsite. You see the camping sign there. In 1964, it was taken over by the Houston family, who were related to the Mackeys. In 1973, this A74 bypassed Telford's road from the south of Alison's bank to beyond Gretna Green, with this stretch of his road being downgraded to the B7076. Now only the toll house and the Glasgow 85-mile milestone between the outlet village and the Green remind us that this was once part of Telford's Great Glasgow and Carlisle Road. The toll house continued to be part of the campsite until 2008, after which it lay empty until it had a complete makeover in 2014 and reopened as a smart cafe. The toll house remains in the Houstons' ownership to this day. At the time of the Scottish independence referendum in 2014, Rory Stewart's old acquaintance cairn was built in the grounds of the toll house. This cairn became a rallying point at the time of the Brexit referendum too in 2016. Here's how the toll house looks today, all smartened up and bearing classy new signs. And the icing on the wedding cake, it was hosting the odd small marriage conducted by a registrar, of course, until the pandemic struck. I don't know how many of these 21st century marriages had taken place up to this point, but with an estimated 9,224 marriages under its belt before then, the toll house can, I think, justly claim to have been Pennant's ultimate resort of all amorous couples. If any of you are interested in finding out more about the characters and goings-on at the toll house, it's all in my books. And thank you all very much for listening to me. Thank you.
Have you got copies with you?
I do have some copy, yes.